The morning her brother handed her their father's will, Agnes was mending a tear in her woolen coat. It was March 12, 1883, and the last of the winter's ice clung to the north-facing eaves of the small sod house like a row of broken teeth. Samuel did not meet her eye. He simply placed the document, folded into a neat square, on the rough-hewn table between them. The paper was cold to the touch. The lawyer's script was precise, the language a fortress of legal terms that amounted to a single, simple fact: the land, the house, the 2 lean cows, and the name they shared now belonged entirely to him. It was the law of inheritance. A son received the earth, a daughter received what the son allowed. He allowed her the 37 sheep her mother had raised from a Welsh line, a collie named Moss with 1 blue eye and 1 brown, and the contents of her small wooden chest. She was given until the end of the week. He was not cruel by nature, but he was a man constricted by the narrow imagination of his time. He saw a sister as a responsibility to be passed on, a woman's life as a journey from her father's house to her husband's. He had already arranged a position for her as a laundress in Prairie Ridge. "It is good work," he said, his voice flat with the finality of the decision. Agnes looked past him, through the single glass-pane window at the vast, indifferent expanse of the plains. The wind was a constant presence, a sculptor of hills and a thief of warmth. She folded the will and tucked it into her pocket. She looked at her hands, calloused from shearing and tending the flock. She thought of the smell of lanolin, the weight of a newborn lamb, the low guttural language of the ewes. These were the things she knew. These were the things she would not surrender. She stood. "I will take the flock," she said. 2 days later, with a sack of flour, a side of bacon, and her father's worn spade tied to a small handcart, she walked away from the only home she had ever known. Moss trotted at her heels, his gaze fixed on the sheep as they moved like a single grey cloud across the thawing prairie. She walked west, away from the established claims and toward the rugged, unclaimed bluffs that rose from the plains like the spine of some long-dead creature. The land here was considered worthless. It was too steep for the plough, too exposed for a proper house, and held no timber for building. For 3 days she traveled, sleeping in the open with Moss pressed against her back for warmth and the flock huddled in a tight circle around them. The wind was relentless, a physical force that pushed and pulled and stole the breath from her lungs. She learned to read its intentions in the sway of the tall grass and the shape of the clouds. On the 4th day, she found what she was looking for, a series of rolling hills facing due south, their backs hunched against the prevailing north wind. The soil was a dense, heavy clay, studded with limestone. It was not good for farming. It was perfect for digging. She chose her spot at the base of the largest hill, a place where a natural depression offered a slight reprieve from the endless sky. Her first decision under pressure had been to leave, her second was to go not out, but down. The work began with her father's spade. The top layer of sod was thick with tangled roots, and she cut it into heavy, uniform bricks, laying them carefully to one side. Below that was the clay, a damp, stubborn substance that fought her with every shovelful. The labor was methodical, brutal, and solitary. Her world shrank to the scrape of steel on stone, the ache in her shoulders, the rhythm of her own breathing. Moss would lie at the crest of the excavated earth, a silent witness, his head on his paws, watching the slow hollowing of the hill. By the end of the first week, she had a shallow pit. By the end of the first month, she had a space deep enough to stand in. She worked from dawn until the light failed, her only measure of time the movement of the sun across the prairie sky. She was not building a house. She was excavating a refuge. The first winter in the dugout was a lesson in the physics of survival. The structure was rudimentary, a single, low-ceilinged chamber 10 feet wide and 20 feet long, with a narrow, angled entrance to blunt the force of the wind. A smaller, connected burrow housed the sheep. The roof was a lattice of scavenged willow branches, covered with the heavy sod bricks she had so carefully preserved. It was a shelter born of labor and improvisation, a raw and functional response to the vast, killing emptiness of the plains. When the first deep cold of November settled over the land, the air inside the hill was damp and smelled of earth and lanolin. It was not warm. But it was not frozen. The temperature outside might drop to 20 below zero, the wind scouring the landscape with ice, but inside the packed clay walls, the temperature hovered just above freezing. The earth itself was a reservoir of latent heat, a patient thermal battery that absorbed the weak autumn sun and released it slowly through the long, dark nights. She discovered this not through theory, but through observation. She watched the way frost formed on the spade left outside but never on the handle of the interior door. She felt the subtle warmth radiating from the packed earth walls long after her small fire had died down to embers. The sheep were her second source of heat. Their collective body warmth, trapped within their own chamber, raised the temperature by several crucial degrees. She learned to listen to the sounds of the shelter, the soft sigh of the earth settling, the quiet breathing of the flock in the darkness. It was a living space, a cave that breathed with its occupants. Her knowledge was an inheritance, pieced together from fragments of memory. Her mother, who had come from a country of stone and hills, had always said that a wise animal burrows in winter. Humans, in their pride, built fragile boxes on top of the ground, exposing themselves to the full fury of the sky. Agnes, stripped of everything, had been forced into a deeper wisdom. She was learning to live not on the land, but within it. The following spring, as the prairie turned green and the ewes began to lamb, Agnes started the work of expansion. The first winter had been about survival, the second year would be about refinement. She had observed a flaw in her initial design. The single large chamber for the sheep was inefficient. The animals huddled in one corner, and much of their warmth was lost to the empty space. Using the spade, which now felt like an extension of her own arms, she began to dig a second chamber, parallel to the first, connected by a narrow passage. This created a U-shaped burrow for the flock, encouraging them to distribute themselves more evenly and allowing for a natural circulation of air. The warm air from their bodies would rise and move through the passage, creating a slow, constant current of heat. She deepened her own living space as well, digging down another foot and lining the floor with flat stones she prized from a nearby creek bed. She carved niches into the clay walls for her lamp, her few books, and her stores of salt and flour. The work was slow, measured by the inch, not by the foot. Her hands were permanently stained with the color of the earth. In midsummer, her wool sacks full from the spring shearing, she made her first journey to the town of Prairie Ridge. It was a full day's walk. The town was a collection of raw lumber buildings, a place of sharp angles and loud noises that felt alien after months of silence and curves. In the mercantile, a man named Abernathy weighed her wool. He was a man with a ledger for a soul, his eyes assessing the quality of the fleece and the poverty of her clothes in a single glance. He learned her name and her location from the land claim registry. "The girl in the hill," he said, a note of derision in his voice. "Living in a hole with sheep." It's unnatural. Wagner said nothing. She simply held out her hand for the money. He paid her half what the wool was worth. She took it without argument and bought what she needed: lamp oil, salt, oats, and 3 needles. The exchange was a reminder of the world she had left, a world that measured a person by the squareness of their house, not the quality of their thinking. She walked home, the weight of the supplies a comfort on her back. That autumn, with the threat of another winter looming, Mr. Abernathy found himself in a difficult position. A blight had swept through the flocks of the large ranchers to the east, and the wool they brought him was sparse and of poor quality. He needed more to fill an order for the railroad. He remembered the girl in the hill, and the surprising weight and cleanliness of her fleece. Driven by necessity, not curiosity, he rode his horse out to her claim. He followed the faint track her cart had made, expecting to find a miserable hovel, a testament to poverty and despair. Instead, he found something that silenced his preconceived notions. From a distance, there was almost nothing to see but the green swell of the hill. As he drew closer, he saw the neat, stone-lined entrance, angled away from the wind. He saw a small, well-tended garden. He saw Agnes, sitting in the sliver of sunlight at the mouth of her shelter, calmly carding a puff of white wool. There was no sign of squalor. There was only a profound and unsettling sense of order. He dismounted. "Miss," he began, his voice uncertain. She looked up, her expression unreadable. She did not invite him in, but she did not tell him to leave. He took a few steps closer, peering into the shadowed entrance. A wave of warm, earthy air washed over him. It smelled of sheep and hay and something else, something clean and alive. "It's warmer than I'd have thought," he said, stating the obvious because he had nothing else to say. Agnes paused in her work. "The earth holds the heat," she replied. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered without pride or defensiveness. He stood there for a long moment, the prairie wind tugging at his coat, the silence of the place pressing in on him. He saw the healthy, robust sheep grazing nearby, their coats thick and heavy. He thought of the ranchers who had lost half their stock to the cold snaps last year. He cleared his throat. "I'll pay you the full price for this season's clip," he said. And the same again for the next. It was as close to an apology as a man like him could manage. In the spring of 1885, a man appeared on the horizon. He was not a rancher or a merchant, but a new kind of person in this landscape, a man who carried his world in a leather satchel of books and instruments. His name was Thomas, and he was a surveyor, part of a team mapping the unplotted territories for the coming railroad. He was methodical, quiet, and possessed a curiosity that was more scientific than social. He had been drawn by the thin, improbable wisp of smoke rising from a chimney pipe that seemed to emerge directly from the ground. When he met Agnes, he did not see an outcast. He saw a solution to a problem he had been studying in his engineering texts. He asked for a drink of water and stayed for 3 days. He was captivated by the shelter. With Agnes's quiet permission, he took measurements, drew diagrams in his notebook, and used a thermometer to record the temperature differences between the interior and the exterior. He used words she had never heard, like geothermal exchange and passive solar orientation and a thermal mass. He explained how the south-facing entrance acted as a natural heat collector during the day, and how the sheer density of the surrounding earth stored that heat, preventing it from escaping at night. He saw not a primitive burrow, but an elegant piece of engineering, perfectly adapted to its environment. Their conversations were unlike any she had ever had. They did not speak of weather or livestock or town gossip. They spoke of principles. He unrolled his geological maps and showed her the strata of limestone and clay that ran beneath her feet. She, in turn, showed him how the different types of soil held water, how the native grasses anchored the sod, and how the angle of the sun in December was different from the angle in June. "Did you read about this in a book?" he asked one evening, gesturing to the smooth, curved walls of her dwelling. Agnes shook her head, her gaze distant. "I watched the ground," she said. Their connection was not built on flirtation or romance, but on a shared language of careful observation. He saw the intelligence in her hands, and she saw the curiosity in his mind. He recognized her instinctive genius, and she recognized in him a mind that could give names to the things she knew by feel. The warmth of that autumn was deceptive. A strange, humid stillness settled over the prairie in November, the sky a hazy, bruised yellow. The sheep were restless, bunching together and refusing to stray far from the shelter's entrance. Even Moss was agitated, whining low in his throat and pacing the perimeter of the hill. Agnes and Thomas, who had extended his survey work to remain nearby, felt it too, a tension in the air, a sense of something immense holding its breath. The change came on the 20th of the month. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in the space of 3 hours. The yellow sky turned to a solid, slate-gray ceiling. Then the wind began. It was not a normal wind. It was a physical presence, a moving wall of ice and snow that erased the world. The blizzard of 1885 had arrived. They had just enough time to herd the last of the sheep inside before the entrance was sealed by a solid drift. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the howling of the wind, a sound so immense and constant that it seemed to be the sound of the universe tearing itself apart. Inside the hill, a profound quiet descended. Agnes lit the lamp, its small flame a fragile point of light in the vast, roaring darkness. The flock was silent, their breathing a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the storm's fury. For 3 days and 3 nights, they were sealed in their earthen ark. They had stores of dried meat, flour, and water from the small cistern Agnes had dug. The air grew thick with the smell of animals and damp wool, but it remained breathable, thanks to the small ventilation shaft she had painstakingly bored through the roof. The temperature outside, as they would later learn, plunged to more than 40 degrees below zero, a cold so absolute that it could freeze a man's lungs. Inside the shelter, heated by the combined warmth of 38 sheep, 2 humans, a dog, and the deep, abiding heat of the earth itself, the temperature never fell below 35 degrees. They were not comfortable. But they were alive. They survived by listening to the patient, silent wisdom of the ground. When the wind finally stopped, the silence it left behind was more profound than the noise had been. It was a weighted, absolute stillness. After another day of waiting for the snow to settle, Thomas and Agnes began to dig their way out. The snow at the entrance was packed as hard as stone, and it took them hours of labor with the spade and their bare hands to carve a narrow tunnel to the surface. When Agnes pushed through the final layer, the light that met her eyes was blinding. The world had been remade in white. Every contour of the land was gone, buried beneath a smooth, sculpted blanket of snow that stretched to the horizon. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. In the days that followed, the full scope of the blizzard's devastation became horrifyingly clear. The great herds of cattle that defined the wealth of the territory had been all but annihilated. Thousands of animals were found frozen solid, standing upright in the snow, their eyes wide with a final, icy surprise. The wooden farmhouses and ranch buildings that dotted the plains had become frozen tombs. Many were buried to their rooftops, their occupants discovered days later, huddled around dead fires. A search party from Prairie Ridge, led by Mr. Abernathy, rode out on the third day after the storm, their hearts heavy with the certainty of what they would find at the hill claim. They expected to find nothing, a frozen mound where a strange woman had once lived. As they crested the last rise, they stopped. A thin plume of smoke was rising from the center of the hill. They urged their tired horses forward and saw the cleared entrance, a dark mouth in the endless white. Steam rose from it into the frigid air. As they watched, Agnes emerged, blinking in the bright sun. Thomas followed her. Then, one by one, the sheep began to file out into the snow, healthy and whole. The men on horseback sat in silence, their faces raw from the wind, their minds struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. Mr. Abernathy looked at the live, breathing flock, at the simple, ingenious shelter, and at the quiet woman who had built it. He removed his hat, a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. The hole in the ground had not been a sign of poverty. It had been an act of wisdom. In the years that followed the Great Blizzard, the story of the woman who wintered in the earth became a piece of local legend. Agnes and Thomas were married the following spring, in a quiet ceremony at the base of the hill. They did not build a house. Instead, they expanded the shelter, their combined knowledge creating a dwelling of remarkable comfort and efficiency. They added a cool room for storing food, a workshop for Thomas's instruments, and a sun-facing room with a single, precious pane of glass that served as a winter greenhouse. The complex grew organically, following the contours of the land, a warren of interconnected rooms that was always warm in winter and cool in the heat of summer. Children were born and raised within its earthen walls, their lives shaped by the rhythms of the seasons rather than the tyranny of the weather. The perception of the structure shifted in the collective mind of the community. It was no longer seen as a primitive anomaly but as a source of quiet pride, a testament to a different kind of cleverness. Then, in the summer of 1895, the outside world arrived in the person of Dr. Alastair Finch, a professor of agricultural engineering from a university in Pennsylvania. He had read a brief mention of Agnes's survival in a government report on the blizzard's impact and had traveled 2,000 miles to see the structure for himself. He was a man of science, of data and empirical evidence. For a week, he lived with the family, taking meticulous notes, drawing detailed architectural plans, and recording temperature readings with a set of precise thermometers. He measured the humidity, the airflow, the angle of the sun. At the end of his study, he sat with Agnes and Thomas at their long table. "In my field," he said, his voice filled with a kind of academic reverence, "we write papers about insulated foundations and thermal mass. We theorize about subterranean dwellings. You have simply done it." He published his findings in a prestigious journal, calling the shelter a work of vernacular architecture of profound and intuitive genius. News of her brother Samuel was sparse. After losing his farm and most of his livestock in the blizzard, he had sold the devalued land and moved his family to a city in the east. He found work in a textile mill. His few letters spoke of constant noise, of coal soot that covered every surface, and of a persistent cough that would not leave him. Time moved like a slow river across the prairie. The years settled one on top of the other, like layers of sediment, each with its own texture, its own color. Agnes grew old. Her hair, once the color of dark soil, turned as white as winter frost. The lines on her face mapped the seasons she had witnessed, the sorrows she had borne, and the quiet joys she had cultivated. The hill itself changed with her. The sharp edges of the excavated entrances softened, covered now with creeping vines and hardy prairie grass. From a distance, the dwelling was nearly invisible again, a secret held within the green and rolling land. Her children, and then their children, continued to live within the earth. The knowledge that Agnes had gleaned from observation and necessity became family law, then community wisdom. Other families, remembering the lessons of the Great Blizzard, began to build their own homes partially underground, incorporating the principles of the hill shelter into their designs. The foolishness of building a thin wooden box to fight the prairie wind was a lesson that had been paid for in lives, and it was not soon forgotten. The legacy was not in a name carved on a monument, but in the quiet, persistent truth of a better way to live. On a warm evening in late spring, Agnes, now past 80, sat on a stone bench at the entrance to the main room. The collie at her feet was a distant descendant of Moss, with the same watchful eyes. The air was sweet with the smell of new grass and damp earth. A great-grandchild, a small girl with serious eyes, brought her a newborn lamb to hold. Agnes cradled the small, warm body in her lap, her gnarled fingers stroking the soft wool. She looked out at the vast expanse of the prairie, the setting sun turning the clouds to fire and gold. She felt the cool, steady breath of air rising from the shelter behind her. The earth was breathing out the day's heat. The narrator might note, with scientific precision, that the temperature inside the walls of the hill, a few feet from where she sat, was 55 degrees. It had been 55 degrees on this day for nearly 70 years. It would remain so long after she was gone. The structure, and the idea it embodied, was permanent. It endured.